Good to go. So Plato, his epistemology is depicted in a painting entitled The School of Athens by Raphael. Plato is clearly pointing in his painting to the sky, showing that he believes truth can be acquired from the metaphysical. He called the place where all truth can be acquired the world of the forms. We call that his epistemology. This is where truth can be acquired. The world of the forms consists of intangible forms of absolutely everything we see in our material world. The forms are perfect and therefore not in a state of flux, like all the worldly objects that we see, obviously, all around us. Our soul once resided in the world of the forms before we were born. Therefore, young children can categorize. For example, a Chihuahua is a dog, a Great Dane is a dog. They identify these as the same species without being sat down and told. This is called the categorization theory. And every soul has actually seen the perfect form of a dog, and therefore is able to identify all the varieties that we see before us in the world. This attachment occurs, of course, at childbirth due to it being a traumatic event. Therefore, humanity cannot remember all the forms the soul once immersed itself in. Otherwise, according to Plato, we'd be walking around, every individual is an absolute genius. Learning is therefore not a process of acquiring new information. It is about remembering the things that the soul once knew. So it's a process of recall. Plato was taught this epistemology by Socrates, which was obviously his teacher, Plato's teacher, who was subsequently executed for trying to teach his views to the young Athenians. He was killed for his attempted corruption of their young minds. In fact, he was forced to drink hemlock, which he did with a great deal of dignity, because he genuinely believed that the state of Athens was freeing his soul, so it was a death he accepted freely. Socrates and Plato were clearly dualists. In other words, the body and soul are separate. So Socrates, for example, believed that his soul would be freed when his body was killed. And I suppose there are various analogies that you could draw. The cave, oh sorry, we're not there yet. The cage is like the body that entraps or encages the soul. Plato wanted to continue the work of Socrates, but obviously feared for his life. He would obviously succumb to the same fate if he continued with the same, delivering the same philosophy, with the same epistemology. The cave analogy was ambiguous enough to keep Plato safe and ensure that he was able to preserve the legacy of Socrates, who never wrote anything down. So the cave analogy itself, there are several prisoners chained to a cave wall. They have been there since birth and understand their limited existence within the context of the cave only. This is reality. There is nothing else. They are facing the back of the cave, which is far from smooth. Behind them are several puppeteers who are creating shadows with various objects. The shadows, although distorted on the cave wall, are perceived by the prisoners to be real. This provides explanation for a relative understanding. For example, we all have fairly different perspectives on what truth, justice, beauty, or even what good is. We are only seeing the distorted, or the distortions therefore, which are actually on the cave wall. We interpret these ideas obviously differently. One of the philosophers' chains one day, for whatever reason, breaks, and they attempt to leave the cave. Well, they do leave the cave. It is an arduous and bloody journey, which obviously represents a struggle to philosophize and to acquire true knowledge. Once out, however, the free prisoner ventures outside the cave, the world of the forms, where his eyes where his eyes slowly grow accustomed to the light. He is able to see the perfect forms for the first time in his life. Eventually, he is able to see the highest form, the form of the good. Excited about sharing true knowledge, he goes back into the cave, like you would. He's eager to tell society, but his eyes are now not accustomed to the darkness, and he appears to be very clumsy, almost drunk. The things he is saying makes him seem like a crazy man. There is obviously a link here between the escapee and, of course, Socrates, which Plato intended. So we move on to the forms. The forms participate, it's important to acknowledge, in each other. For example, there will be a form of a tree, but within this there is obviously the form of green that participates in this form, the form of brown, the form of wood. There is also a hierarchy of forms. Good is clearly at the top. Abstract forms such as beauty, justice and truth follow, and they are followed finally by material objects, material forms. There are also, it's worth noting, forms of bad things like the HIV virus and other rather nasty things. So clearly there are criticisms with this argument. There's firstly, and the most damning criticism, there's no empirical evidence. Plato would counter this, however, by saying, well, that's the point. The world of the forms, if it were physical, would cease to be perfect, and it would be therefore in a state of flux, and that would defeat the whole object of the world of the forms. Knowledge, another criticism, does seem to be acquired via our empirical senses. We only have to perhaps look at how children play. The great Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky and the work that he did seem to suggest that children do acquire knowledge through empiricism. There must be forms of everything. This gets very complex. Lost bus tickets in missing library books. Absolutely everything. There must be, otherwise it would cease to exist. The world is not accurately represented by a cave, of course, as well. Whilst there are rather dingy places in the world is also beautiful. Penultimately, Plato assumes the escapee would want to return. I would question this, if you've been to the world of the forms, which is actually absolutely perfect, would you really want to go back to an imperfect, dark, dingy world? Finally, the fire in the cave is essentially a small sun, offering a glimpse of truth in the cave, but there is no truth apparently to be found in the cave. This is slightly problematic.